Osiris was murdered by his own brother. His body was torn apart and scattered across Egypt. Isis, his wife, went out and gathered the pieces and put him back together, and he went down into the kingdom of the dead and never came back up. You already know that story. Almost everyone does. The Egyptians never wrote it down, not once, not in 3,000 years. They carved pieces of it into the walls of pyramids. They sang parts of it in temples. They sailed it out into the desert once a year, and they named their own dead after him. What they never did across the entire life of their civilization was tell it from beginning to end. Tonight, we are going to go through the whole of it, where Osiris came from and what his name actually means, which is still not known. What Isis did, which is a great deal more than the grieving most retellings allow her. How the kingdom of the dead was surveyed, mapped and governed, with gates and passwords, and a court of 42 judges. And how the whole thing ended on one specific afternoon with a single man and a chisel. We are going to start with the closest thing they left us, and it is not in Egypt. On a hill above Dublin Castle, set back from the traffic, there is a room kept deliberately dim. The light is low because the objects in it cannot tolerate light. Behind glass, laid flat on a mount, is a sheet of papyrus about 55 centimetres long, brown as old tea, its fibres running in two directions like a woven mat. It was bought in Egypt in the 1930s, and when it surfaced, it had been torn and crushed. Somebody had folded it, somebody had stood on it, or something heavy had rested on it for a very long time. The handwriting on it is hieratic, the running cursive that Egyptian scribes used for everyday work, the way a doctor's prescription relates to a carved inscription over a bank door. It was written in the 12th century, before the Common Era, in the reign of a king we call Ramesses V, and it probably came out of a scribe's private collection at Thebes. On one side there are love songs. 16 pages in, the songs give way to something else. What follows is the longest continuous narrative about Osiris, Isis, Horus and Seth that survives from ancient Egypt. Not one of the longest, and it is a comedy. It runs to 80 years of litigation. The gods convene as a tribunal and fail, repeatedly, to decide who should inherit the throne of Egypt. They adjourn, they reconvene, they write letters to an older goddess for advice, and she writes back with a compromise nobody accepts. Seth complains that Horus is too young and that his breath smells of milk. There is a boat race in which Seth carves a vessel out of solid stone, paints it to look like cedar, and it sinks because it is made of stone. There is an episode involving a bed and a hand and a lettuce, which the papyrus describes in a level of anatomical detail that kept Victorian translators reaching for Latin. At one point, Isis disguises herself as a beautiful young widow and tricks Seth into pronouncing judgment against himself in public before he understands what he has agreed to. He notices immediately afterwards. It does him no good. The court has heard him. It is worth staying with this papyrus a little longer because almost nobody reads it. It is far stranger than its reputation. The dispute opens with the court already exhausted. 80 years have passed. The Ennead, the 9 great gods, sitting as a tribunal, has been unable to reach a verdict, and the reason is that the presiding god will not accept the one everybody else has reached. Every time the case is put, the gods find for Horus. He is the son. The office belonged to his father. The law is not complicated, and every time the sun god objects, on the grounds that Horus is too young and too weak, and that the throne of Egypt should go to the strongest, which is Seth. At one point the court is so deadlocked that they write to an older goddess, Neith, and ask her opinion. She replies by letter. Give the office to Horus, she says, and give Seth compensation, double property, and 2 foreign goddesses as wives. The gods read the letter aloud and agree it is excellent. Then they carry on arguing for years. The contests that follow are physical. Horus and Seth transform into hippopotami and submerge, agreeing that whoever surfaces first within 3 months has lost. Isis, watching from the bank, cannot bear it and harpoons them both, including her own son, and has to pull the weapon out again. Later, there is the boat race. The condition set is that each must build a vessel of stone. Horus builds one of pine and plasters it over so that it looks like stone, and it floats. Seth, taking the condition literally, cuts a mountaintop and makes a real stone boat, and it goes straight to the bottom. Between the contests, there is an episode that Egyptologists spent a century declining to translate properly. Seth invites Horus to spend the night at his house. What follows is an attempted sexual humiliation, because in Egyptian thought, the one who penetrates dominates the one who is penetrated, and Seth is not seeking pleasure. He is seeking a legal argument. Horus catches the semen in his hands. He goes to his mother. Isis cuts off his hands and throws them into the water, then makes him new ones, and gathers his seed instead, and takes it to the garden where Seth's lettuces grow, and spreads it on the leaves. Seth eats his lettuce, as he does every day. Then he goes to court, and announces triumphantly that he has performed the act of a male against Horus, and should therefore be granted the office. Thoth calls the semen of each of them. Seth's answers from the river, where it was thrown. Horus's answers from inside Seth's own body, and emerges from the top of his head as a golden disc. The court, which has been sitting for 80 years, finds this conclusive. There is more, including a moment where Horus, enraged at his mother for showing mercy to Seth, cuts off her head, and she has to be restored. The papyrus reports this without much comment, in the same tone it uses for the boat race. Now, scholars have argued for decades about what tone this text is in. Some read it as satire, a scribe having fun at the expense of theology. Some read it as political allegory about Ramesside succession disputes. Some read it as perfectly serious theology in a register we have lost the ear for. I lean towards the last, and here is why. The comedy is not aimed at the gods. It is aimed at the process. 80 years of hearings, a written opinion from an eminent outside authority that everyone praises and ignores, a presiding officer whose personal preference overrides the law, and a case eventually decided on a technicality of evidence. No scribe there is mocking religion. That is a scribe who worked in the Egyptian administration, writing about the Egyptian administration and putting the gods in it. This is the fullest Egyptian telling we have, a Ramesside scribe's entertainment, filed alongside his love poetry, in which the most important gods in the world behave like litigants in a long-running property dispute. And now look at what is missing from it. The sealed chest, cut to fit his body, the tree at Byblos that grew around him, the 14 scattered pieces, the fish that swallowed the one part Isis could not find, and the replacement she made with her own hands. None of it is here. Not a line. None of it is in any Egyptian papyrus. And it is not here, because it is nowhere. No papyrus has it. No tomb wall, no coffin, no temple, no amulet, no stela. This is a civilization that covered every available surface with religious writing, in greater quantity than any other culture of the ancient world. And the one story we most associate with it is simply absent from the record. What they left instead is illusion. A line here, a phrase there, a gesture towards something the reader is expected to have known since childhood. Spells that begin in the middle. Hymns that praise a man for surviving an event they decline to describe. Rituals performed over the sick and the dying that name the participants and skip the plot. The version we tell was written in Greek, at Delphi, around 100 years into the Common Era, by a man who had probably never been further up the Nile than Alexandria. That gap is where this whole episode lives. Not the myth as it is usually retold, but the strange, specific shape of the evidence that the myth left behind. Because I want to argue something that runs against the way this material is nearly always presented. The absence of a written story is not a hole in the record. It is the single most informative fact we have about what Osiris was. Let us start with the Greek. His name was Plutarch. He was born in a small town in Boeotia in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. He was educated at Athens. He travelled to Rome and lectured there. And for the last decades of his life, he served as one of the 2 senior priests at the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. He is best known now for his paired biographies of Greeks and Romans, the ones Shakespeare mined for Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. But he also wrote a great deal of philosophy, and among that philosophy is a long essay addressed to a woman named Clea. Clea was a priestess at Delphi, and she was also an initiate in the mysteries of Osiris. Plutarch wrote the essay for her, and in it he does something no Egyptian text ever does. He tells the story straight through. Osiris is a king. He rules well, teaches agriculture and law, and travels to civilize the rest of the world. His brother, whom Plutarch calls Typhon, conspires against him. Typhon secretly measures Osiris and has a beautiful chest built to those exact dimensions. At a banquet he offers the chest to whoever fits it. Everybody tries. When Osiris lies down in it, the conspirators slam the lid, seal it with molten lead, and throw it into the river. The chest floats out to sea and comes ashore at Byblos on the Phoenician coast, where a tree grows around it and encloses it. The king of that country, admiring the tree, has it cut and made into a pillar for his hall, not knowing what is inside. Isis, searching, comes to Byblos. She takes work as a nurse to the queen's infant son. She is discovered, she is granted the pillar, she cuts her husband out of the wood, and she takes him home. Typhon finds the body while out hunting by moonlight. He tears it into 14 pieces and scatters them. Isis searches again and recovers all of them, but one, the phallus, which had been thrown into the river and eaten by fish. She makes a replacement and holds a funeral for each part where she found it. Horus is conceived, or already conceived, depending on which sentence you read. He grows up, he fights his uncle, the kingship passes to him, Osiris rules the dead. That is the story. That is the whole architecture of what people mean when they say Egyptian mythology. Now consider the distance. Osiris is securely attested in the Egyptian record by the middle of the 5th dynasty, roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era, and the god behind him is almost certainly older than that. Plutarch is writing around 2,500 years later. To put that in a frame that might land, the gap between Osiris appearing in Egyptian texts and Plutarch describing him is longer than the gap between Plutarch and us. He is also writing in a different language, from a different religious tradition, with an explicitly philosophical agenda. He is a Platonist. He wants the myth to mean something in Platonic terms, and so he reads Osiris as order and reason, and Typhon as disorder and matter, and the whole conflict as a moral dualism between good and evil principles. That reading is coherent. It is elegant. It is also not especially Egyptian. Egyptian theology is famously reluctant to sort the world into good and evil in that clean way. Seth, the god Plutarch calls Typhon, spends most of Egyptian history as a perfectly respectable member of the pantheon, with temples and priests and royal devotees, which we will come to. So Plutarch has taken a set of Egyptian materials and pressed them into a Greek philosophical mould, and the result is the only continuous version anybody has. Here is my first flat opinion, and I want to state it plainly rather than hide it inside a hedge. We should stop calling this the Osiris myth. We should call it Plutarch's Osiris, not because it is worthless. It is not. In several places he is demonstrably well informed. He knows that Abydos is the great Osirian pilgrimage site, and that wealthy Egyptians wanted burial there to be near the god. He knows about the island at Philae, and the tomb on it that priests visited at fixed times, and that the island was otherwise off limits. He knows the Apis bull at Memphis was understood as an image of the soul of Osiris. Those are not the kinds of details you invent. Somebody who knew Egypt told him, or he read a source now lost. Scholars have long suspected there was at least one systematic Greek handbook on Egyptian religion circulating in the Roman period, now gone, which he and Diodorus Siculus both used. But he also derives Egyptian words from Greek roots, which is nonsense, and he assigns motives and emotions in ways that belong to Greek narrative habit rather than Egyptian ritual thinking. Calling it Plutarch's Osiris keeps two things in view at once. It respects him as a witness, and it stops us from quietly assuming that a Greek philosopher's summary is what an Egyptian farmer in the Fayum believed in the reign of Senwosret, because we can go and look at what the Egyptians actually left. It is enormous, and it is nothing like a story. Begin underground at Saqqara, in the last pyramid of the 5th dynasty. The Pyramid of Unas is small. Beside the great 4th dynasty monuments at Giza, it looks almost apologetic. A low mound of rubble with a modern door in one side. Inside, the burial chamber walls are covered floor to ceiling in columns of hieroglyphs cut into fine white limestone and filled with blue pigment. These are the pyramid texts. They are the oldest body of religious writing that survives from anywhere on earth in this quantity, and the version in this pyramid contains around 228 separate spells. Across all the pyramids that carry them, something like 759 distinct spells are known. No single pyramid has them all. They are not a book. They are not a scripture. There is no narrative order, no doctrine laid out, no beginning and no end. Each unit begins with the formula, words to be spoken, and then says something. Some of them are ritual instructions. Some are offering lists. Some are startling, violent poetry. The so-called cannibal hymn in the Pyramid of Unas describes the dead king hunting down the gods and eating them to absorb their powers. And scattered through all of it, constantly, are references to Osiris, to his murder, to his restoration, to Horus and Seth fighting, to Isis, and Nephthys mourning him and raising him up. But watch how they refer to it. A representative line runs something like, Horus comes and Thoth appears, and they raise up Osiris from upon his side, and make him stand erect before the two Enneads. That is the whole reference. No context, no explanation of why he is lying on his side, or who put him there, or what happens next. The text assumes the reader knows all of it already. Egyptologists have a term for this kind of statement. They call them mythic statements, or mythological allusions, sentences that clearly point to a story without telling it. And this produced one of the more interesting arguments in modern Egyptology, which ran for decades and has never entirely settled. In the 1970s, the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann published a provocative paper suggesting that early Egypt did not really have myths in the sense that Greece had myths. Not because the stories were lost, but because that kind of connected narrative about gods had not yet developed as a form. His argument, roughly, was that early Egyptian religion operated through what he called constellations, gods defined by their relationships to one another rather than by their biographies. Osiris is defined by being the father of Horus, the brother of Seth, the husband of Isis, not by things that happen to him in sequence. On this reading, the mythic statements in the pyramid texts are not fragments of a lost epic. They are the whole thing. The narrative came later, as a secondary development. In 1991, John Baines published a careful and quite devastating response. Baines had spent years working on what he called decorum, the rules governing what could be written or depicted, by whom, and in what setting. His point was that arguing from absence in the pyramid texts is dangerous, because the pyramid texts are a highly restricted genre carved inside sealed royal tombs. What you find there tells you what was appropriate to carve inside a sealed royal tomb. It does not tell you what people told each other. Early Egyptian writing, Baines noted, strongly favours lists, tables, and schematic arrangements, precisely the forms that writing is good at and that oral storytelling is not. Absence of written narrative may simply mean narrative stayed oral. Others, including the linguist Jochem Zeidler, went further and argued that some of the mythic statements are implicitly narrative anyway, and that the story was there all along. I find Baines the more persuasive of the three, and I think the argument from decorum is close to unanswerable. But I want to push somewhere slightly different, and this is the second position I will stake out. the debate has largely been about whether the story existed. I think the more interesting question is why it never seemed necessary to write it down. And I do not think the answer is only about genre conventions. Look at what these texts are doing. They are not describing Osiris. They are addressing him. Or rather, they are addressing the dead king as him. The formula in spell after spell is Osiris Unas, Osiris Teti, Osiris Pepi, the god's name fused directly onto the name of the man in the coffin. By the New Kingdom, this has spread to everyone with a decent burial. The coffin of a priest of Min reads the Osiris Pa'ib. A scribe's heart scarab reads the Osiris. Scribe of the Mat, Nahahu. Nobody refers to a character in a story that way. That is how you refer to a status somebody has entered. Narrative implies an audience standing outside the events, watching. The Egyptian funerary material consistently puts the reader inside the events, as a participant with a speaking part. You do not need a plot summary of something you are currently inside. That is why the closest thing to a continuous Egyptian account is not a story at all. It is a hymn. It is carved on a limestone stela now in the Louvre, made for a man named Amenmose, who was an overseer of cattle for the temple of Amun in the 18th dynasty. 28 lines of text, opening with praise. Hail to you, Osiris, Lord of eternity, King of gods, of many names, of holy forms. It goes on to give a fuller account of Osiris as a living king before his death than almost anything else in Egyptian, and even mentions Isis searching and Horus avenging. But it is structured as praise, not as plot. It moves by accumulation of epithets, not by cause and effect. And even there, at its fullest, the murder itself is passed over almost in silence. The Egyptians were reluctant to write down the killing of Osiris in plain terms at all. Naming a thing gave it power. You did not put the death of the god into permanent stone if you could avoid it. There is one other document that deserves mention here, partly because of what it says, and partly because of what happened to it. In the 8th century before the Common Era, Egypt was ruled by a Nubian dynasty out of Kush, and one of those kings, Shabaka, set up a slab of dark stone in the temple of Ptah at Memphis. The introductory lines explain what it is. The king, restoring the temple, had found a work of the ancestors, a document eaten by worms, no longer legible from beginning to end, and had ordered it copied afresh into stone so that it would survive. What follows is the text we call the Memphite theology, and it is one of the most philosophically ambitious things to survive from Egypt. It argues that creation was accomplished by Ptah through thought and speech. He conceived the world in his heart and spoke it with his tongue, and it existed. It also contains an account of the settlement between Horus and Seth, in which the country is divided and then reunited under Horus at Memphis, with the reed of the south and the papyrus of the north bound together on the doors of Ptah's temple. And it contains a version of the death of Osiris in which his body is washed ashore at Memphis, and Memphis, not Abydos, is where he is buried. That last detail is the tell, and it is why scholars argue about this stone. Shabaka was a Kushite king who had recently taken Memphis, a city that had been a centre of resistance to Nubian rule. Erecting a monument that made Memphis the site of creation and the burial place of Osiris was, among other things, extremely convenient. So the argument runs like this. One camp holds that the text really does preserve something very old, copied from a decaying original, as the king claims. Another holds that the archaic language is deliberate antiquing, and that the whole thing was composed in the 25th dynasty, as political theology dressed in an old costume. It has not been settled, and I will not pretend it has. I lean slightly towards the text containing genuinely older material that was reshaped for the moment, which is the least dramatic reading, and therefore the least popular one. What happened to the stone afterwards is the part I cannot get out of my head. At some point after antiquity, somebody found this slab lying about and put it to use. There is a square hole cut through the middle of it, and 11 deep grooves radiating out from that hole across the inscription. It was used as a millstone. Somebody bolted it down and ground grain on the account of the creation of the world for years, until the centre of the text was worn away. The stone is now in the British Museum, and the damage is unmistakable. The philosophy survives around the edges. The middle is gone, ground out by the ordinary business of making flour. I struggle to think of a more exact image for how this material has come down to us. So that is the archive. Spells, hymns, ritual notes, festival records, amulet formulae, coffin decoration, temple reliefs, one satirical papyrus in Dublin, millions of words and no story, before going further into what that archive contains. It is worth asking where this god came from in the first place, because the answer is less tidy than it usually sounds. Start with his name. In Egyptian, it is written with two signs, conventionally transliterated as WSJ, and vocalized by modern scholars in a dozen different ways. Wesir, Usir, Asar, Ausar, and others. Nobody knows what it means. I am not simplifying for a general audience here. After 2 centuries of Egyptology, with the language reconstructed in extraordinary detail, the etymology of the name of the most important funerary god in Egypt remains genuinely unresolved. Proposals have included the powerful one, the place of the eye, and several readings based on the 2 signs used to write it, one of which is a throne and one of which is an eye. None commands agreement. What we can trace is a set of older gods who look very much like ingredients. At Abydos in Upper Egypt, from the very beginning of dynastic history, there is a god called Khenti-Amentiu. The name means foremost of the Westerners, and in Egyptian usage, the Westerners are the dead because the sun sets in the west and the cemeteries lie on the west bank. Khenti-Amentiu appears on First Dynasty necropolis seal impressions, in a sequence that names each king with the title Horus Khenti-Amentiu, running back to Nama. He had a temple at Abydos in pre-dynastic times. Later, Khenti-Amentiu is simply an epithet of Osiris, and the great temple that had belonged to him becomes the Great Temple of Osiris. Far to the north, in the delta, there was a local god called Anjeti, meaning he of Anjet, the town the Greeks called Busiris. Anjeti is old, probably prehistoric, and he is shown holding 2 objects, a shepherd's crook and a flail. Those 2 objects become the standard insignia of Osiris, and later of every Egyptian king. Osiris carries a herdsman's tools for the rest of Egyptian history. There is also the Djed, a pillar with 4 horizontal bars near the top. It is one of the oldest symbols in Egypt, and its original meaning is not securely known. A stripped tree, a bundle of stalks, a pole with sheaves tied round it. By the Old Kingdom it is being read as the backbone of Osiris, and raising it upright becomes a royal ritual of enormous importance. There is one more thread that runs underneath all of this, and it is the reason the whole system had a calendar. Egypt did not have rain in any meaningful quantity. Egypt had a river that flooded, and the flood was the difference between a harvest and a famine. Every year, in high summer, the Nile rose, spread across the valley, deposited a layer of black silt, and receded. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, after that silt. The desert either side was Deshret, the Red Land, and that word sits inside the epithet Seth would eventually carry. The flood arrived at roughly the same time as an astronomical event, and the Egyptians noticed. Every year, after about 70 days of invisibility, the star we call Sirius reappeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn. That reappearance is called a heliacal rising, and in Egypt it fell close to the start of the inundation. Sirius was Sopdet, whom the Greeks called Sothis, and by the New Kingdom she was thoroughly identified with Isis, and Osiris was identified with the constellation we call Orion. In the pyramid texts, the dead king is repeatedly associated with that group of stars, and the association holds for the next 2,000 years. Now consider the sky those identifications describe. Orion sets, he goes below the horizon and is gone. Then Sirius rises, alone, ahead of the sun, and the river begins to come up. The whole shape of the myth is written into the annual behaviour of 2 points of light. The husband goes down. The wife appears afterwards, on her own, and what follows is the flood, the silt, and the grain. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the sort of observation that gets overextended, and I do not want to claim more than the evidence supports. There is no Egyptian text that says the myth was invented to explain the stars, or the flood. That would be a modern reading imposed backwards, and the Egyptians did not generally think in terms of one thing being an allegory for another. Their habit was to hold several true descriptions of the same reality at once. What the evidence does support is that these things were understood as the same event, described from different positions. Osiris going into the ground, Orion going under the horizon, the river rising, the grain germinating in darkness, the sun descending into the corpse at the 6th hour, and a man in a coffin at Saqqara, not symbols of each other, instances of the same thing. That is a genuinely different way of organising the world from the one most of us grew up inside. And it is worth pausing on before we go any further, because everything that follows depends on it. We are accustomed to a distinction between the literal and the figurative. When we say a person has gone to their rest, we know they have not lain down. Egyptian thought does not appear to have run that division in the same place. When a coffin says the Osiris Par-Ib, it is not saying Par-Ib is like Osiris, and it is not saying Par-Ib has become a separate copy of him. It is saying something for which we do not have a comfortable English word. The nearest I can get is this. There was one event, going down and being renewed, and it happened in the sky, and in the river, and in the field, and in the coffin. It was the same event each time. The picture that emerges is not a god who was invented. It is a god who accumulated, a delta herdsman deity with a crook and a flail, an Aberdeen lord of the western dead, a pillar that may once have been a harvest fetish, a funerary practice reaching back into the pre-dynastic. These converge over centuries into a single figure, and by the 5th dynasty, that figure has a name we cannot translate, and a role no earlier god had held. There is one more theory worth mentioning, and I want to flag it clearly, as speculation, because it is repeated on the internet as though it were established. Some Egyptologists have suggested that behind Osiris there stands a real person, a pre-dynastic ruler in the Delta, possibly a shepherd king, whose reign was remembered as so beneficial that he was gradually deified. The crook and flail are offered as supporting evidence. I do not believe this can be shown, and I want to be honest that it is unprovable with current evidence. There is no inscription, no burial, no king list entry, nothing but the plausibility of the idea, and the shape of two objects. It might be true. We have no way to know, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. What we can say is that by the time the pyramid texts were carved, Osiris already had the position he would hold for the next 3,000 years. He was the dead king. He was the one who had gone down and not come back, and who ruled from there. Which raises the obvious question. If Osiris was buried, where was the tomb? The Egyptians had an answer. They were wrong about it in a way that is, I think, one of the most revealing errors in the history of religion. About 11 kilometers west of the Nile, halfway between modern Luxor and Asyut, the cultivation stops and the desert begins. The ground rises in a long, low shelf towards a wall of cliffs, pale and featureless in daylight. And in that shelf, there is a stretch of ground that the local Arabic name calls el-Ka'ab. It means mother of pots. The name is descriptive rather than poetic. The surface of the site is covered in broken pottery, not scattered, covered. Sherds lie so densely that they form the ground surface, layer on layer, over an area of several hectares, and the estimates run into the millions of vessels. Every one of them was carried out there by somebody who walked from the temple, across the low desert, up the wadi, to leave an offering at what they believed was the burial place of Osiris. They were standing on the tomb of a first dynasty king named Jer. el-Ka'ab was the royal cemetery of the earliest Egyptian state. The kings buried there are the ones at the very beginning of the written record: Nama, Aha, Jir, Jet, Den, Ka'ar, and the woman Mernith, who was either regent or ruler in her own right, and whose tomb sits among theirs as an equal. Their burials were subterranean chambers lined with mud brick, roofed with timber, filled with grave goods. Nothing about them looks like a temple. They were tombs built for men who had ruled a country that had only just become a country. By the Middle Kingdom, something like 1,000 years later, the Egyptians had lost track of who these people were. The first dynasty had passed out of living memory into legend. The tombs were shapeless mounds in the desert behind the town. And at some point during that period, the tomb of Jer was identified, decided, agreed, believed to be the tomb of Osiris himself. We do not know exactly how the identification was made. It may have had to do with the wadi that runs up into the cliffs behind the site, which the Egyptians read as the entrance to the west. It may have been an accident of which mound happened to be visible. It may have had priestly politics behind it. What we know is what followed. The tomb was cleared out and rebuilt as a cult site. Priests of Osiris were installed. A stone staircase was cut down into it, and the pilgrims began to arrive, and did not stop for 2,000 years. In 1898, the French excavator Émile Amélineau dug into Djers's tomb, working with the speed and carelessness that make his reports so frustrating to read now. In the central chamber, he found a life-sized basalt figure of Osiris, lying on a funerary bed, with lions carved at the head and foot. It was a dedication, probably made during the Second Intermediate period, by a king demonstrating his piety. Somebody had brought a stone god into the reused tomb of a forgotten king, and laid him out to sleep. Here is what makes the whole arrangement extraordinary, and I want to hold on it for a moment. Djer's tomb is one of the largest of the early royal burials, and around the central chamber there are subsidiary graves, small, close-packed, arranged in rows. The count at Djer's complex runs to something over 300, and the total number of individuals associated with his burial has been put at 338. They are courtiers, servants, women of the household, dwarves, dogs, and donkeys, and the evidence indicates strongly that they did not die naturally. The graves were all closed at the same time. The skeletal evidence and the arrangement point to strangulation. These people were killed at the funeral to accompany the king and buried in a single operation. The practice appears at the very start of the First Dynasty, peaks with Djer, declines through the following reigns, and stops entirely by the end of the dynasty. It is one of the few genuinely brutal episodes in early Egyptian history, and it was abandoned within a few generations. What replaced it, eventually, was the Shabti figurine, which we will come to later. So set the two facts beside each other. For roughly 2,000 years, the holiest destination in Egyptian religion, the place where the god of resurrection and moral judgment was believed to lie, was a mass grave of strangled retainers, and nobody making the pilgrimage had the faintest idea. I find this one of the most instructive things in the ancient world, and here is the position I want to take on it. Sacred places are not discovered, they are made, and the material they are made out of is forgetting. The pilgrims at Abydos were not naive, they were doing something serious and considered, but the sanctity of that ground was manufactured out of an error, sustained by a gap in the record, and reinforced by 1,000 years of everybody else believing it too. That is not a cynical observation, and I do not intend it as a debunking. It is closer to the opposite. It suggests that what made Abydos holy was never the presence of a body. It was the traffic. Millions of pots, carried out by millions of people, each of whom was there because others had been there. The holiness was in the walking, and we know a remarkable amount about what that walking looked like, because of one man who left an account, and then left the important part out. His name was Iconofret. He was a treasurer in the 12th dynasty, under Senwosret III, in the 19th century, before the Common Era. He grew up at the royal court, and he tells us that he was made a companion of the king at the age of 26, which was clearly a significant honour. In the 19th year of the reign, the king sent him south to Abydos with a specific commission, and gold that had been captured in Nubia, and instructions to make monuments for Osiris. Ikhernofret did the work, and then he set up a limestone stela recording it, which is now in Berlin. It is our single best source for what the mysteries of Osiris actually involved. He built a portable shrine of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and fragrant woods. He worked on the sacred bark, the neshmet, and fashioned its cabin. He decorated the body of the god with lapis and malachite and electrum. He organized the lay priests and taught them the calendar of festivals. Then he describes the festival itself in 4 movements. First, the procession of Wepwawet, the jackal god whose name means opener of the ways, going out to champion Osiris. Ikhernofret led it. There were rites concerning the enemies of the god. Second, the great procession. The bark leaves the temple carrying the god, and the funeral of Osiris is enacted in the open, in front of the population, moving out from the town towards the desert. Third, the combat. Ikhernofret says he repelled the attackers of the Neshmet bark and overthrew the enemies of Osiris on the sandbanks of Nedit on the day of the great fight. Nedit is the place where, in the fragmentary illusions, Osiris was struck down. Fourth, the return. The god comes back in triumph to the temple, and Horus is installed. Notice what he does not say. He tells us that he led the procession. He does not tell us where it went in detail. He tells us there was a great combat. He does not tell us what happened in it, or who fought, or how. He tells us that he adorned the god in his capacity as an initiated priest, having purified himself, and he uses the phrase, master of secrets. He is writing an account of a mystery, and he is being careful. Everything operational is there, the gold, the woods, the staffing, the calendar. Everything that mattered religiously is veiled. This is a man boasting about his own competence in front of the god for eternity, while scrupulously not saying the thing itself. It is one of the few places in Egyptian literature where you can feel a person deliberately withholding. By the Ptolemaic period, more than 1500 years later, the Assyrian festivals had grown into something enormous. And here we do get detail because the priests of the late period wrote their ritual instructions onto temple walls. The rooftop chapels of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera and the Osiris Chapel in the Temple of Isis at Philae carry long inscriptions describing the rites of the month of Khoiak, which fell in the season of inundation as the flood was receding. The festival ran for 30 days, and the texts are extraordinarily specific. Hundreds of priests and priestesses take the parts of the gods. 34 small reed boats carry divine images. 365 lamps are lit. Dozens of jed amulets are prepared, and on the 25th day of the month, the 2 goddesses are brought in. 2 women were chosen for this. The instructions specify that they should be pure in body, with their body hair removed, wearing wigs, holding tambourines. On the arm of one, the name of Isis was written. On the arm of the other, the name of Nephthys. Then they sang. The text they sang survives in more than one version, and the fullest is on a papyrus now in the British Museum. Scholars call it the Songs of Isis and Nephthys, or the Festival Songs of the 2 Kites. The kite being the small raptor whose thin, carrying cry was heard as the sound of women mourning. It is a lament, and it is one of the most direct pieces of writing to survive from ancient Egypt. The goddesses alternate, and they do not describe the death of Osiris or explain it. They call him home. Come to your house, they sing. Come to your house, you of Heliopolis. Come to your house, for your enemies are not. Fair one, come to your house that you may see me, for I am your sister whom you love, and you shall not be parted from me. There is a version shortened for private funerals, adapted so that any dead person could have it read over them, because any dead person was Osiris. Consider what is happening in that room at Dendera or Philae, a woman with a name written on her arm, standing in for a goddess, singing to a wooden figure, asking it to come home, and the same words, scaled down, being read over a dead farmer in a provincial cemetery by his sister, using her own voice. Which brings us to her. I want to make an argument about Isis. that I think is straightforwardly correct and almost never made directly, so let me make it directly. The story we call the Osiris myth is not about Osiris. Structurally, in every version we possess, he is the object, she is the subject, track is agency. He is a king, and then he is deceived, and then he is killed. After that he is transported, enclosed, discovered, dismembered, scattered, gathered, reassembled, wrapped, mourned, and enthroned. Every one of those is something done to him. He never acts again. Even his fatherhood is achieved through her. In the Egyptian versions, Isis takes the form of a kite, hovers over the body, and draws the seed from it herself. Now track hers. She searches. She travels. She negotiates. She works as a nurse in a foreign court. She recovers the body. She reassembles it. She conceives. She hides the child in the marshes. She heals him when he is stung. She litigates for 80 years. She wins. The reason this matters is that the Egyptian material tells you her power was the point. Her standing epithet is Wert Hekau, usually translated great of magic. But Haker is not magic in the sense of conjuring tricks. In Egyptian thought, Haker is a fundamental force, older than the gods, one of the energies present at creation. It is closer to efficacy, the capacity of a word to make a thing so. Isis is the deity who commands it more completely than anyone else, and there is a story. That explains how she got it, preserved on a papyrus at Turin, and another in the Chester Beatty group from the 12th century before the Common Era. Ra has grown old. He dribbles. Isis gathers his saliva from the ground, mixes it with earth, and shapes a serpent from it, which she leaves on the path he walks every day. The serpent bites him. Ra collapses in agony and calls all the gods, and none of them can help, because the creature was made from his own substance, and there is no remedy for a thing being poisoned by itself. Isis comes forward and offers to cure him. There is one condition. She needs his true name. Egyptian thought held that a being had several names, and one of them was the real one. The Ren, hidden, containing the essence. To know it was to have authority over the thing named. Ra tries to deflect. He offers his public names. I am Khepri in the morning, Ra at midday, Atum in the evening. Isis waits. The poison works. Eventually he gives in, and the text says the name passed from his body into hers. Read that. Plainly. The most powerful entity in the Egyptian cosmos is disabled by a weapon built out of his own body, and surrenders his identity under duress to a goddess who engineered the entire situation. Nothing about that is a grieving widow. That is somebody who plays a very long game and does not lose. So here is my position, stated without hedging. Calling this material the Osiris myth is a categorization error that has shaped how it has been read for 2,000 years, and it came to us through Greek and Roman writers who were more comfortable with a story organized around a dead king than one organized around a woman's competence. The Egyptians were not confused about this. When they needed protection, when they were ill, when a child was bitten by a scorpion, when a woman was in labor, they did not call Osiris. He is in the ground. They called her. The clearest evidence for how ordinary Egyptians actually used her is not in a temple. It is in the objects people kept at home. There is a category of monument that Egyptologists call a chippus, and the plural is sipi. They start appearing in numbers in the late period, and they continue into Roman times. Most are small, the size of a hand, or a book, carved from steatite or a dark hard stone, and they were kept in houses. The design is standardized. In the center stands a naked child with the sidelock of youth, facing directly out at you, which Egyptian art almost never does. He is standing on two crocodiles. In his fists he holds serpents and scorpions, and often a lion by the tail, and an antelope by the horns. Above his head is the grinning dwarf face of Bes, the household god who guarded women in childbirth. The child is Horus, and the images are illustrating a story. The infant hidden in the marshes of the delta by his mother, out of Seth's reach. and stung there by a scorpion. The finest of these objects is now in New York. It is usually called the Metonic stela. It stands about 83 centimetres tall, and it was made in the reign of Nectanebo II, the last native Egyptian king, in the 4th century, before the Common Era, for a priest named Esatum. Its surfaces are covered in text. Among the spells is the account of what happened in the marsh, how Isis came back and found the child rigid and unresponsive, and how her cry brought the sunboat itself to a halt in the sky. Thoth came down from it and recited, and the poison came out. And the spells do not end with the child. They end with a formula that repeats and repeats across the stone, and the protection of the afflicted as well. Now here is how the object worked, and this is the part that changes how you see the whole of Egyptian religion. Some of these stelae survive, still fixed in their bases, and the bases have channels and shallow basins cut into their upper surfaces. You poured water over the stone. It ran across the carved spells and the figures, picked up their power, and collected in the basin. Then you gave it to the person who had been bitten, and they drank it. What we are looking at is a delivery system. The spell is the active ingredient, the stone is the container, and water is the solvent. Somebody worked out that liquid could carry the potency of a written text and built the plumbing. I do not think there is a better single illustration of what Heka meant to these people. Not a mood, not a metaphor, a substance that could be dissolved off a surface and swallowed by a frightened parent's child at 2 a.m. And notice which? Crisis, the whole apparatus is designed for. Not war, not famine, not the flood. A child stung in the dark, and a mother who cannot make it stop. That is what they asked her for. Across 1,000 years, in houses whose walls are gone, in a country whose language died, the object people kept within reach was the one showing a small boy who had been poisoned and had lived. There is a line in a medical papyrus of the 15th century before the Common Era, among remedies for real diseases, that simply asks Isis, great of magic, to deliver the patient from every bad and evil thing. She was the one who came when called. That is not a supporting role. One figure in all of this has been standing slightly out of the light, and she should not be, because she is present at every important moment. Nephthys is the 4th of the children of Geb and Nut. Isis is her sister, Osiris is her brother. Seth is her brother and also her husband. Her Egyptian name, Nebet-Hut, means lady of the house or mistress of the mansion, and it is one of the least informative names in the pantheon. She has no great cult centre of her own. There is no temple of Nephthys to visit. She has almost no independent mythology. What she has is a position. She is always beside Isis. In the funerary art, the two of them stand at either end of the coffin, Isis at the feet, Nephthys at the head, with their arms raised, or their wings spread across the body. On sarcophagi they are carved at the corners, embracing the stone. In the mourning texts they are the 2 kites, the pair of birds crying over the body in the marsh. The Egyptians called them the 2 sisters, and in the lamentations they sing in alternation, and it is Nephthys who supplies the answering voice that makes the grief a duet rather than a solo. There is a strand of tradition, which Plutarch reports, and which some Egyptian material supports obliquely, in which Nephthys sleeps with Osiris, and the child of that union is Anubis, and Nephthys abandons him out of fear of Seth, and Isis finds the infant and raises him. I want to flag that as uncertain. It is not securely attested in the earlier Egyptian record, and Plutarch may be transmitting a late tradition or a Greek elaboration, but it points at something the Egyptians clearly did believe, which is that Nephthys defects. She is married to the murderer, and she takes the victim's side, and she stays there for 3,000 years. And Anubis is worth a paragraph of his own, because his career is a case study in what Osiris did to the older gods. Before Osiris, Anubis was the principal god of the dead, the jackal on the western cliffs, lord of the necropolis, the one who counted the burials. In the earliest material, he is the senior funerary deity in Egypt without competition. Then Osiris arrives and takes the throne, and Anubis is not removed. He is reassigned. He becomes the embalmer, the one who prepares the body, who leads the dead by the hand to the hall, who kneels at the scale and adjusts the plumb line. In the judgment scenes, he is technical staff, working while Osiris sits. The priest performing the mummification wore a jackal mask. Examples survive. To be Anubis was a job, and somebody did it, in a hot room, for a wage. There is no story of Anubis being deposed. There was no conflict, no myth of succession, no theological quarrel that anyone recorded. A god who had been supreme became a specialist, and the record simply shows him doing the new work. Egyptian religion absorbed almost everything it met. That is why it lasted, and it is also why it is so difficult to describe. Nothing was ever thrown away. It was given a different position and kept on. And if we have misread her, we have misread her brother even more badly. Seth was not the devil. This is going to be uncomfortable if your image of him comes from any popular retelling, because in those he is essentially Satan with a strange animal head. In actual Egyptian religion, he is one of the most complicated and durable gods in the pantheon, and for most of Egyptian history he is a perfectly ordinary object of worship. His oldest known cult centre is Nubt, near modern Nakada in Upper Egypt, and it is very old as anything in Egypt. He is lord of the Red Land, the desert, as Horus is lord of the Black Land, the floodplain. That is a complementary pairing, not a moral one. Egypt needed both. He is the god of storms, of foreign countries, of disruption, of sudden violent force. Those were not read as evil. They were read as necessary. A country of farmers dependent on a river understood perfectly well that the world contains things that arrive without warning, and he has one function that nobody else can perform. Every night, the sun god travels through the underworld, and every night he is attacked by Apophis, a serpent of pure negation, chaos with no purpose, the thing that wants existence to stop. Apophis has to be defeated, or the sun does not rise. The god who stands in the prow of the solar bark and spears him is Seth. Only Seth is strong enough and violent enough for the job. There is something almost startlingly sophisticated in this. Egyptian theology puts the murderer of Osiris in the front of the boat, every night defending creation, because the qualities that made him dangerous are exactly the qualities the situation requires. In the pyramid texts, Seth carries the epithet great of magic, just as Isis does. He is not outside the system. He is load-bearing. Now watch what happens to him. In the 19th dynasty, a military family from Avaris in the eastern delta comes to the throne. Avaris had been the capital of the Hyksos, the Levantine rulers of northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, and it had a long and vigorous cult of Seth. The founder of the dynasty is Ramesses I. His son is named Seti, which means, quite literally, man of Seth. That son becomes one of the great kings of Egypt and builds the temple at Abydos that still stands. Later in the same royal line comes a king called Setnacht, meaning Seth is strong. One of the garrisons of Ramesses II held Seth as its patron, and Ramesses II erected a stela at his new delta capital, commemorating 400 years of the Seth cult in the region. For roughly 2 centuries, the god who killed Osiris is the family deity of the ruling house of Egypt, and nobody appears to find this contradictory. Then it ends. After the 20th dynasty, no new temples are built for Seth. No new royal names invoke him. And over the following centuries, something more active happens. His images are hacked off temple walls. His name is chiseled out. His figure is erased from reliefs where he had stood beside kings for generations. By the late period and into the Ptolemaic era, the transformation is complete. He is the Red One, wholly malevolent. In some texts he is identified with Apophis, the very thing he had spent 3,000 years killing. The Dutch Egyptologist Herman te Velde set out the explanation that most scholars still work from, and it is political rather than theological. Between the 20th dynasty and the Ptolemies, Egypt was invaded and occupied repeatedly. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians. Twice. The country that had spent its entire history telling itself that it was the ordered centre of the world spent 500 years being ruled by people from outside it. And Seth was the god of foreigners. That had been one of his ordinary attributes, a piece of divine job description. It became a liability, and then an accusation. So, here is the third position I want to put on the record. Egypt did not discover that Seth was evil. Egypt needed him to be. A civilization under sustained foreign domination reorganized its theology around its trauma, and it did so by taking the god who had always represented the outside and converting him from a necessary force into an enemy, not by decree, by a slow, distributed, unrecorded consensus, expressed one chisel stroke at a time on temple walls by workmen nobody named. We tend to imagine that religious beliefs cause political behaviour. Here the arrow points the other way, and it is visible in the stone. Theology followed events, and then dressed the result up as something eternal, which is worth remembering when we go down into the kingdom Osiris ruled, because the Egyptians described that place in more detail than any other people in the ancient world described anything. The Egyptian word is Duat, and it is usually translated underworld, which is not quite right. Underworld carries a Greek shape, a hollow place beneath the ground where shades drift. The Duat is not that. It is a country. It has geography. It has rivers and gates and caverns and fields and lakes of fire and mounds. And the beings who live in each of them have names and duties and shifts. Above all, it has hours. The Egyptians divided the night into 12, and they mapped the Duat onto those 12 hours as a linear journey from west to east. The sun sets, enters, and travels through, and at the end of the 12th hour, it comes out of the eastern horizon as the dawn. Before the 12 hours, there was a map. Among the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, there is a section that scholars call the Book of Two Ways, and it is different from everything else in the corpus, because it is drawn. Coffins from the cemetery of Deir el-Bersha in Middle Egypt have it painted on the inside of the floor, directly under where the body lay, so that the dead person was resting face down on their own route. It shows two paths running roughly parallel across the underworld. One is a waterway, drawn in blue. One is a land road, drawn in black. Between them, separating them along their length, is a lake of fire. Both lead to the same destination, Rostal, the domain of Osiris, described as a dark place ringed with flame at the boundary of the sky. Along the routes are gates, and at each gate a guardian, and each guardian has a name. The text supplies the names, and that is the mechanism. Knowledge is the key. Say the correct name to the correct being, and the gate opens. Fail to know it, and you stop there. This is the oldest known map of an afterlife from anywhere in the world, and in 2019 it got older. A Belgian team led by Harco Willems had opened a burial shaft at Deir el-Bersha some years earlier, and recovered 2 badly decayed cedar panels from a looted coffin. When the inscriptions were studied properly, they turned out to be a version of the Book of Two Ways, older than any previously known, pushing the composition back into the 21st or 20th century, before the Common Era. The coffin had long been assumed to belong to a local governor. The study concluded it had actually held a woman of the elite, named Ankh. So the earliest illustrated guide to the underworld that survives from human history was, as far as we can tell, made for a woman, and painted on the floor beneath her. What I find remarkable about the Book of Two Ways is not the map itself, but what it assumes. It assumes the underworld can be surveyed, that it has a stable enough geography to be drawn to a consistent layout, that the same gates are in the same order every time, and that the information can be written down in advance and carried. None of that is a mystical intuition about death. That is a route plan, of the kind a trader would want before crossing a desert. Distances, obstacles, checkpoints, and the passwords for each. And the text is quite explicit, that possession of the knowledge is what matters. There is a line stating that anybody who looks upon the body of Osiris will never entirely die. Not anybody who is good, anybody who knows. That tension between knowing the route and deserving to arrive runs right through Egyptian funerary religion, and it never resolves. The Book of Two Ways sits at the knowledge end. The judgment hall, which we are coming to, sits at the other. The Egyptians carried both in the same coffin for 2,000 years and appear not to have found it a contradiction. The book that describes this journey is called, in Egyptian, the Book of the Hidden Chamber. Egyptologists usually call it the Duat, from a phrase meaning that which is in the Duat. It appears first in the royal tombs of the 18th dynasty, in the Valley of the Kings, painted directly onto the walls. The earliest versions look extraordinary and almost nothing like Egyptian art. In the tomb of Amenhotep II, the figures are drawn as spare cursive stick figures in black ink on a yellow ground, as if a papyrus scroll had been unrolled and pinned to the walls of the burial chamber. That was deliberate. The point was that this was a text, not decoration. The king was buried inside a book. The journey goes like this. In the first hour, the sun enters the west. The god who travels is not Ra in his daytime form. He is a ram-headed figure, and the Egyptians called him the flesh of Ra, the body of the sun, no longer shining, going down. The middle hours pass through a long inhabited landscape. Gods stand in rows, waiting. Some of them are named nowhere else in Egyptian religion. Many of them are simply described as those who are in this place, and they exist only for the moment when the boat passes them, and they receive light, speak, and then the light moves on, and they return to darkness. There is something almost unbearably tender in that image. Beings who exist for 1 hour a night, whose entire purpose is to be briefly illuminated. In the 7th hour, the boat is attacked. Apophis lies across the water and drinks the river dry, so that the bark runs aground on the sandbank of the serpent. The crew have to fight. Isis and the eldest sorcerer, who in these texts is Seth, use spells to hold the serpent, and he is speared and cut, and driven back, and the water returns. This happens every single night. It is never permanent. There is no final victory over Apophis in Egyptian thought, only a nightly one, which has to be won again tomorrow. But the centre of the whole book is the 6th hour, and the 6th hour is the deepest point of the night. In the 6th hour, the Ba of Ra, his mobile soul, the part that flies, descends into the corpse of Osiris, which lies motionless in the depths and cannot move, and cannot leave, and never will. And for a moment they are one thing. The texts describe it with a formula that translators have rendered in various ways, and the plainest version runs: he rests in him, and he rests in him. Elsewhere it is put as the corpse of Ra resting in Osiris, and Osiris resting in the corpse of Ra. Out of that union the sun is remade, and begins the climb towards the eastern horizon. Eric Hornung, who spent his career on these texts and produced the first modern edition of the Duat, called this the great mystery at the heart of Egyptian religion, and I think he was right. Let me try to say why it matters. In most religious systems that have an afterlife, death is a problem to be solved. Something has gone wrong, and the theology exists to repair it, or to compensate for it, or to explain it away. Egyptian cosmology does something structurally different. It makes death load-bearing. The sun does not survive the night despite the underworld. It is renewed by going into it. The freely moving soul of the living God has to descend into a body that is permanently dead and join with it and take something from it that it cannot generate on its own. Or morning does not happen. Osiris cannot rise. That is the condition of his existence. He is bound down there, and the texts are quite clear about it. But the sun cannot rise without him. So the dead are not a residue, they are a component. The whole machine of the world runs on a nightly transaction between what moves and what has stopped, and neither one is sufficient alone. There were other books. The Book of Gates maps the same journey, but organises it around 12 gates, each guarded by a serpent with a name. The Book of Caverns divides the underworld into 6 sections and is much more concerned with punishment. The Litany of Ra lists 75 forms of the sun god and identifies the king with each of them in turn. They do not entirely agree with each other, and the Egyptians did not appear to mind. Multiple descriptions of the same thing, each true in its own frame, was a normal condition of Egyptian religious thought, rather than a failure of it. But every one of these books puts the union of the sun with Osiris at its centre. Whatever else the Duat was, it was the place where that happened. Now, the sun goes through the Duat because it is the sun. A dead Egyptian went through it because they had to be assessed first, and that is where the whole system turns from cosmology into law. Before we go into that hall, we need to know what was on trial, because the Egyptian answer to what a person consists of is nothing like ours. We tend to work with 2 components, a body and something else, soul, mind, self, which is singular and which either continues or does not. The Egyptians worked with at least 6, and they had different fates. There was the cat, the physical body, the flesh. It could rot, and preventing that is what embalming was for. There was the ka. This is the hardest one to render in English. The word is often translated as vital force or double, and the hieroglyph is a pair of upraised arms. The ka came into existence with you at birth, and it was the part that needed sustenance, which is why food offerings were left at tombs, and why the offering formula asks for bread and beer for the ka of the deceased. The ka did not travel. It stayed with the body and with the statues, and it had to be fed. When Egyptians said someone had died, one of the phrases they used was that he had gone to his ka. There was the ba. The ba is drawn as a bird with a human head, the person's own face on a small hawk, and it is the part that moves. It leaves the tomb at dawn, goes about, and returns at night. It is closest to personality, or to presence, the quality by which someone is recognizably themselves. There was the This is what you became if everything went right. The word is connected to a root, meaning to shine or to be effective, and the is the transfigured, functional spirit, the successful outcome of the whole process. Rituals to produce this state were the point of the funeral. There was the Ren, the name, as long as your name was spoken or written, you continued. This is why erasing a name from a monument was an act of violence, and why so much Egyptian effort went into getting names carved somewhere durable. The name was not a label on the person. It was a component of them. There was the shoot, the shadow, which was understood as real and as attached, and which appears in funerary papyri, walking beside the bar. And there was the the heart, which was the seat of thought and memory and moral character, and which is the peace. That gets weighed. Now look at what this system implies. A person, in Egyptian terms, is an assembly. Several distinct things, held together during life, which come apart at death, and each of which has to be separately maintained. The body has to be preserved. The ka has to be fed. The ba has to be able to find its way back to the body each night, which is why the face on the coffin mattered. It was a landmark. The name has to be kept in circulation. The heart has to be kept in the chest. Miss one, and the whole thing fails. That is why an Egyptian tomb looks the way it does. It is not a monument to a dead person. It is a maintenance facility, with a food supply, a set of identifying portraits, a written name repeated dozens of times, a preserved body, a backup body in the form of statues, and a door left for the ba to come and go. And it explains the horror of the second death, which we are about to meet. Amit does not destroy a soul. She dismantles an assembly, and there is nothing left in any of the 6 places where a person was being kept. The judgment scene is the most reproduced image in Egyptian art, and almost nobody looks at what it is actually doing. It comes from spell 100, and 25 of the collection we call the Book of the Dead, which the Egyptians called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That collection contains something over 190 spells, and no single papyrus has all of them. because each copy was assembled for an individual according to what they wanted or could afford. Spell 125 is set in a room called the Hall of the Two Truths. In it sit 42 assessors. Here is the detail that gets lost. The 42 are not named in the ordinary sense. They are given epithets and a place of origin, and they are strange ones. He of the long strides, who comes from Heliopolis. Fire embracer, who comes from Kerahar. Nosy, from Hermopolis. Bonebreaker, from Heracleopolis. Blood eater, from the slaughterhouse. The number 42 is not random either. Egypt was administratively divided into nomes, provinces, and the number of them hovered around 42. So the court that judges you is assembled from the whole country. One judge per district. The dead person is being tried by Egypt itself. The dead person addresses each one in turn and denies a specific offence. I have not committed sin. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not stolen the property of a god. I have not told lies. I have not taken food from the mouth of a child. I have not damned the dead. I have not diverted water at its season. I have not dammed a canal of running water. I have not put out a lamp that should be burning. Egyptologists call this the negative confession, or the declaration of innocence, and it is one of the earliest developed statements of personal ethics anywhere in the world. Look at what it contains. Water theft, interfering with irrigation, speaking badly of the dead, extinguishing a light, being the reason a child went hungry. That is a moral code produced by people who lived along a single river and shared its water, and who understood exactly which small acts destroy a community. But look at the form of it, because the form is the interesting part. The scholarly view is that this list does not descend from a devotional tradition. It appears to descend from an oath of purity, the kind of declaration a man had to swear before entering temple service, affirming that he was ritually clean and had committed no disqualifying act, which means that when the Egyptians tried to imagine what happens after you die, they reached for a legal instrument. They pictured a hearing, assessors, testimony, a record, a standard of proof, and an outcome that follows from the evidence. Then comes the scale. The heart of the dead person is placed in one pan. In the other is a single feather, the emblem of Ma'at, the principle the Egyptians used for truth, order, justice, and the correct functioning of the world, all at once. Anubis adjusts the plumb. Thoth stands by with a palette and records the result. And beside the scale, in most versions, crouches a creature. Her name is Amit. The name means, plainly, devourer of the dead. She is assembled from the three animals most likely to kill an Egyptian: the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She has no myth. There is no story about Amit. She does not appear in the pyramid texts or the coffin texts. She turns up in the New Kingdom, crouching beside a scale in painted papyri, and she crouches there for the next 1500 years, and she never does anything except wait. If the heart is heavy, she eats it, and here the Egyptian system diverges sharply from what most people assume. This is not hell. There is no punishment, no torment, no duration. What Amit performs is deletion. The Egyptians called it MWT, dying a second time, and the second death is total. The Ka, the vital force. The Ba, the personality that travels. The Ah, the transfigured spirit. The heart itself. All of it stops existing. Not somewhere else. Not suffering. Simply not. For a culture that spent its resources so extravagantly on continuation, the punishment for failure was not agony. It was to be edited out. And now we arrive at the object I find the most psychologically revealing thing to survive from ancient Egypt. And I want to slow down for it, because the Egyptians looked at that scale and that court and that outcome, and then they manufactured a device to interfere with it. It is called a heart scarab, a large amulet, usually of green or dark stone, jasper, serpentine, glazed steatite, carved in the form of a beetle and often 8 or 9 centimeters long. It was placed over the chest of the mummy, sometimes mounted in gold, tied with cord, laid directly against the wrappings above the heart. On the flat underside is a spell, which Egyptologists number 30b. The dead person is speaking, and they are speaking to their own heart. O my heart which I had from my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. And then, at the end, a line that changes the temperature of the whole thing. Do not tell lies about me in the presence of the god. Sit with the situation this creates. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of memory, thought, character, and conscience. That is why it was the organ left inside the body during embalming, when everything else was taken out. It was the record. It knew. They then built a system in which the record testifies at your trial, and then they mass-produced, in hard green stone, across every level of society that could afford it, for well over 1,000 years, an object whose function was to instruct the record to keep quiet. Some of these scarabs were even carved with the owner's face on the beetle's back, so the heart would be reminded whose side it was on. Here is my reading, and it is a firm one. They did not think they would pass. Not individually, not as a culture. You do not industrialize a countermeasure against a test you expect to survive. The heart scarab is what a civilization produces when it has articulated a moral standard, so demanding that it has quietly concluded nobody actually meets it, and has decided to handle the discrepancy technically rather than morally. There is a whole theology of grace implicit in that little green beetle, and the Egyptians never wrote it down either. They just put the object in the coffin millions of times and hoped. I want to be fair to them, though, because there is a more generous reading available, and it may well be right. Some scholars point out that the Egyptian heart was understood as unpredictable. It could betray you not through wickedness, but through mere disorder, the way a person blurts something out. On that view, the spell is not a bribe. It is a request for coherence. Please be the person I actually was. I find both readings persuasive at once, which may be the most Egyptian thing about the object. Getting to that hall in the first place required work, and the work was industrial. Everybody knows the Egyptians mummified their dead. Far fewer people know that most of what is repeated about how they did it comes from Herodotus, a Greek tourist writing in the 5th century, before the Common Era, who was working from what guides told him, and who got a number of things demonstrably wrong. It is worth saying what he got wrong, because the corrections are more interesting than the errors. Herodotus describes 3 grades of service: the most expensive, the middling, and the one for the poor, with prices attached, like a menu. That part appears to be broadly sound. Embalming was a commercial trade, and you got what you paid for. His account of the procedure is where it gets complicated. He describes the brain being drawn out through the nostrils with an iron hook, and the rest dissolved with drugs. He describes the abdomen being opened with a blade of Ethiopian stone, the organs removed, the cavity washed with palm wine and packed with spices, and the body then covered in natron for 70 days. Modern examination of actual mummies confirms some of this and complicates the rest. The brain was indeed usually removed through the nose, though the tool was more often a rod used to break up the tissue than a hook designed to pull it out whole, and in a good many bodies, the brain was simply left in place. The 70 days is closer to a total for the whole funerary process than a period spent in natron, and the natron itself was almost certainly used dry, packed around, and inside the body, rather than as the bath that Herodotus implies, and that a great many later writers repeated. His most quoted claim is also the one that has aged worst. He states that the natron treatment for the cheapest grade involved a caustic liquid injected into the body to dissolve the internal organs. There is essentially no physical evidence for this in the surviving corpus of bodies from any period, and the consensus now is that Herodotus was told something garbled, or misunderstood what he was shown, or was being entertained by a guide who had noticed that the visitor liked a grisly detail. That last possibility is not a joke. and I raise it because it applies to a great deal of what Greek and Roman visitors wrote about Egypt. They arrived in a country that was already ancient, whose temples were already tourist attractions, with a priesthood that had every incentive to tell impressive stories, and a supporting industry of guides who did not necessarily know very much. Some of the Greek graffiti at Egyptian monuments is unmistakably the work of people who had been told nonsense and had believed it. Visitors at Thebes were shown a colossus that hummed at dawn and told it was Memnon, a Trojan war hero, which it was not. So when we say that our fullest narrative of the Osiris myth comes from a Greek, it is worth holding that alongside this, the Greek sources on Egypt are our indispensable witnesses, and they are also a record of what Egyptians were prepared to say to foreigners. There is a passage in Herodotus where he explains that he knows the sacred stories, and that he is deliberately not going to repeat them, because to write them down would be improper. He does this more than once. He alludes to a mystery performed at night on a lake, representing the sufferings of a god whom he pointedly declines to name, although it is obvious from context which god he means. And there it is again, the same silence from a foreign tourist in the 5th century before the Common Era, that Iconofret kept at Abydos 1400 years earlier, and that Apuleius would keep 600 years later. 3 men across 2,000 years, in 3 languages, all reaching the same point and stopping. Whatever was at the centre of this, everybody who got near it agreed not to say. That changed in 2023, and it changed because of a hole in the ground at Saqqara. In 2016, an excavation directed by the Egyptian archaeologist Ramadan Hussein began working on a group of shafts in the Saqqara necropolis, not far from the Pyramid of Unas, the same pyramid whose walls carry the pyramid texts. About 30 meters down, at the bottom of a shaft, they found a room. It was an embalming workshop, dating to the 26th dynasty, in the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. There was a ledge cut for the body to lie on, and a drainage channel, and a large fumigation vessel. And there were pots, 31 ceramic vessels, and this is the part that made the find exceptional. Many of them were labelled, not just with contents but with instructions. For the head, for washing the body, for making the bandages fragrant, for treating the liver, for the stomach. A team from Munich and Tübingen, working with the National Research Centre in Cairo, ran the residues through gas chromatography and mass spectrometry and published the results in Nature. For the first time, Egyptian words that had been guessed at for a century could be matched to actual chemical compounds. 2 terms in particular had always been translated loosely. Antior was usually rendered myrrh, and sephet as some kind of sacred oil. The residues showed that, at this workshop, antior meant a specific mixture based on coniferous oils, and tars and sephet was an unguent with plant additives, not myrrh at all. The full inventory is remarkable: cedar oil, juniper or cypress tar, pistachio resin, castor oil, animal fats, heated beeswax, bitumen, each combination assigned to a particular procedure, prepared in a particular vessel, applied to a particular part of the body, and then 2 substances that should not have been there. Elemi, a resin that reaches Egypt from tropical Africa or Southeast Asia, and damar, which comes from a family of trees that grows, and grew then, only in the rainforests of Southeast Asia, the Malay Peninsula, Indonesia, the Philippines. There is no version of the ancient world in which damar reaches a workshop at Saqqara by accident. To make one Egyptian into Osiris, in the 7th century before the Common Era, required a supply chain running from Indonesian rainforest to a chamber 30 meters under the Egyptian desert. Somebody had learned what that resin did. Somebody had established the route. Somebody was paying for it consistently, at scale. Ramadan Hussein, who found the workshop, died unexpectedly before the paper was published. His colleagues named him in it. Once the body was prepared, wrapped, masked and coffined, one more thing had to happen, and it is the ritual I find hardest to shake. It was called the opening of the mouth. The mummy, or the coffin, or a statue of the deceased, was stood upright on clean sand. A priest wearing a leopard skin, called the Sem, performed a series of acts that could run to 75 distinct episodes in the fullest versions, which are carved on tomb walls, including that of the Vizier Rekhmire. The purpose was to restore function. The dead person could not see, speak, breathe, eat, or hear. The ritual gave those back. The tools were specific. An adze, a woodworking blade of the kind a carpenter uses to shape a beam, was touched to the mouth. The ceremonial versions were made of meteoric iron, which the Egyptians called iron of the sky, because it had fallen from there. There was a serpent-headed blade. There was the foreleg of a bull, freshly cut, still warm, held up to the mouth. And there was a small forked flint called the peseshkef. The peseshkef has a fishtail shape, and Egyptologists established some time ago what its original use had been. In the Old Kingdom, and before, that shape of blade was used by midwives to cut the umbilical cord. The goddess associated with birth was sometimes shown with one on her head. So the final act performed on an Egyptian body at the door of the tomb, with the family standing in the sun outside, involved a midwife's blade being touched to the mouth of the dead. They were not being sent away, they were being delivered. All of this, the workshop, the resins, the blades, the scarab, the papyrus of spells, cost money, which raises a question that Egyptology has been arguing about for over a century, and where the argument has recently gone somewhere uncomfortable. Who was allowed into the kingdom of the dead? The standard account, the one still repeated in most popular treatments, goes like this. In the Old Kingdom, the beatified afterlife belonged to the king alone. The pyramid texts are carved only in royal pyramids, and only the king becomes Osiris and ascends. Then the Old Kingdom collapses, and during the disorder of the First Intermediate Period, provincial nobles seize what had been royal privilege. Versions of the same spells start appearing on the coffins of officials, and we call them the coffin texts. Osiris is no longer the king's alone. Then in the New Kingdom, the material moves onto papyrus, becomes portable, and can be bought. Anyone with the price of a scroll can equip themselves for eternity, and we call that the Book of the Dead. Egyptologists named this process the democratization of the afterlife, and it is a genuinely lovely narrative arc. Privilege captured from a collapsing monarchy and distributed downwards over 1,000 years. It was formulated by James Henry Breasted in 1912, in the first serious study to use the pyramid texts comprehensively, and it stuck. It is elegant, it is teachable, and it fits comfortably with how a scholar in the early 20th century wanted history to work. It has been under sustained attack for about 25 years, and among specialists, it is now effectively dead. The most direct assault came from Harold Hayes, in a paper he opened with the observation that so much had already been written against the theory, that it might be considered obsolete, and yet there it still was, in every textbook. He called the paper The Death of the Democratization of the Afterlife, which is not a subtle title. The objections are cumulative, and they are hard to argue with. Non-royal religious texts exist in the Old Kingdom. They are not common, but they are there, and they undercut the claim of royal exclusivity at the foundation. The sharp division between pyramid texts and coffin texts does not hold up either. The two corpora share substantial content and ritual purpose. They are not two systems separated by a revolution. They are one tradition, differently displayed. And that word, displayed, is where the argument gets interesting. Hayes and others make a distinction between access and display. The question of whether an Old Kingdom official could hope for a good afterlife is separate from the question of whether he could afford to carve the relevant material on his tomb walls, or was permitted to. Egyptian religion ran on ritual performance by trained priests. What secured your afterlife was the correct rites being carried out by people who knew how on your behalf. The written text was a record and a guarantee, not the mechanism. So the appearance of funerary literature in non-royal burials may not mark the moment ordinary people gained entry. It may mark the moment they gained the resources and the permission to advertise something they had always been reaching for. Now here is where I want to complicate the correction, because I think the specialists are right, and I also think something has gone slightly missing. The dismantling of democratization is sound scholarship, and I accept it, but the argument has been conducted so thoroughly on the level of texts that it risks producing a false stillness, a picture in which nothing much changed across 3,000 years. Something obviously changed. You can see it in the ground at Abydos. Those millions of pots are not evenly distributed through Egyptian history. The pilgrimage becomes a mass phenomenon in the Middle Kingdom. Ordinary people start building small chapels along the sides of the processional wadi, so that their names would be present when the god went past. Stelae are set up by the hundred, by men with modest titles, asking to be among the followers of Osiris. That is a change in behaviour, at scale, involving people who were not aristocrats. It is not a change in doctrine, it is a change in participation. And if the specialists are right, that access was never the issue, then what we are watching is not a theological liberation at all. It is a market, which is, I would argue, the darker reading, not the lighter one. Under the old model, the story was that Egyptian religion became more generous. Under the corrected model, the story is that Egyptian religion stayed constant and the ability to purchase visible participation in it spread. Eternity was not opened up, it was monetized. There are Book of the Dead papyri that were clearly produced in bulk, with the spaces for the owner's name left blank and filled in later by a different hand. You could buy your afterlife off the shelf and have your name written in. And there are heart scarabs, including a fine one belonging to a woman named Hatnefer, where the name has been inserted over erased text. The amulet was made for somebody else first. Nothing about that is a democracy. That is a supply chain. So what were people buying their way into? What did the Egyptians think the good outcome actually looked like? The answer is unexpectedly concrete, and it tells you a great deal about them. The place is called the Field of Reeds, Seketi Aru in Egyptian, often rendered Aru. It is where the justified dead go, and it is not a garden of light or a state of union with the divine. It is farmland. The texts and the tomb paintings describe it in specific detail. Cultivated plots, measured and named, irrigation canals, water channels that have to be filled, grain that has to be sown and grown and cut, barley described as growing tall, and the emmer wheat taller. It is the Nile Valley, exactly as it was, with the failures removed. Nothing floods too high or too low. Nothing withers, the harvest never fails. Disputes do not happen, and the social order continues without friction. I want to be careful not to make this sound naive, because it is not. It is an afterlife designed by people who understood that a life without work is not obviously desirable, and that the thing you actually want is not the absence of labour, but the absence of precarity. They did not want to stop farming. They wanted the river to behave. But work in the Field of Reeds was still work, and it was assigned, and this is where the Egyptians did something so revealing that I think it deserves its own place in any account of their religion. In life, an Egyptian owed labour to the state. After the inundation, canals had to be cleared, and dikes rebuilt and irrigation infrastructure repaired, and the crown conscripted the population to do it. The system is usually called corvée, and it was a real and heavy obligation. There was one legal way out. If you could afford it, you could send a substitute in your place. The Egyptians looked at the Field of Reeds, understood that the gods would assign them agricultural duties there, and applied the same solution. The object they invented is called a shabti, or ushabti, and the second form of the word means, precisely, answerer. A shabti is a small mummiform figurine, usually between 10 and 20 centimetres tall. The finest are made of glazed faience in a deep blue-green that still looks wet after 3,000 years. The cheapest are unfired clay, roughly pinched, with a face pressed in by a thumb. Most of them carry tools. A hoe in one hand, a pick or mattock in the other, and a small seed bag slung over the shoulder. And most of them are inscribed with a spell, the 6th in the Book of the Dead, descended from an earlier spell in the coffin texts, which is written in the form of a summons and a reply. The summons runs, O Shabti, if the Osiris, and here the dead person's name and titles are inserted, is called upon to do any work that is done in the land of the dead, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the banks, to carry sand from the east to the west, then you shall say, and the figurine answers, Here am I, it says, I shall do it. That is the whole text, on hundreds of thousands of little blue figures, buried across 2,000 years of Egyptian history. A call, and a small voice agreeing. By the new kingdom, the wealthy were buried with 365 of them, one for every day of the year. Some burials went further. And then there are the overseers. Because a workforce of 365 requires management, the Egyptians included supervisory shabtis, usually one for every 10 workers. The overseer is dressed differently, not in mummy wrappings, but in the pleated linen kilt of a living official. And he carries a whip. That is the detail I keep returning to. When Egyptians imagined paradise, they reproduced the state labor system, including the man with the whip, and then arranged to be on the correct side of it. I do not raise this to sneer. It is not hypocrisy. It is what happens when a society imagines eternity honestly, using the only materials it has, which are the arrangements it already lives inside. Every culture does this. The Egyptians simply left the receipts. There is one more object that carries the whole theology, and it is the simplest of all of them. The tomb of Tutankhamun, cleared in the 1920s, contained roughly 5,000 objects, and among the gold and the chariots and the shrines, there was a wooden frame about 190 centimeters long, cut in the outline of the god Osiris. It was filled with silt from the Nile, and into that silt, before the tomb was sealed, somebody sowed barley and watered it. Egyptologists call these Osiris beds. The barley germinated. In the sealed darkness of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, with no light and no further water, it sprouted, grew pale and thin, and died. When the object was found, the dried remains of that crop were still lying in the shape of the god. The practice belongs to a wider ritual complex. During the Khoiak festival, temples made what are usually called corn mummies. Small figures moulded from earth, sand and grain, wrapped in linen bandages, sometimes finished with a face mask of gilded beeswax, and laid in miniature coffins, often with a falcon head at one end. The temple texts at Dendera lay out the procedure across the days of the month. Grain measured, grain mixed, grain moulded, grain watered, grain sprouted, figure wrapped, figure buried, the following year's figure prepared, while the last one is interred. These were not put in private tombs. They belonged to the cult, made annually in the temple, part of the mysteries themselves. And at the end of Khoiak, the pillar was raised. The Jed, the object that had come to mean the backbone of Osiris, was lifted from horizontal to vertical, in a ceremony where the king himself hauled on the ropes. The dead god's spine stood up, and the country planted its crop. Now I have to be careful, because this is exactly the point at which popular writing goes wrong, and it goes wrong in a specific and long-standing way. In 1890, James George Fraser published The Golden Bough, and in it he assembled a category he called the dying and rising god, Osiris grouped with Tammuz from Mesopotamia, with Adonis, with Attis, with Dionysus, gods of vegetation who die and return, whose story is the agricultural year. That category has been taken apart by scholars over the last several decades, most influentially by Jonathan Z. Smith, and the objection is not fussy. The individual cases turn out to be doing quite different things, and forcing them into one pattern erases what each culture actually said. For Osiris, the objection is specific, and it matters. Osiris does not rise, he is restored. He is made whole, and wrapped, and made able to speak and to rule. And then he stays exactly where he is, forever, in the depths, and never comes back up. The sun rises. The barley rises. The king who succeeds him rises. Osiris is the ground they rise out of, and the ground does not go anywhere. That is a fundamentally different proposition from resurrection, as most people now use the word, and flattening it into a general pattern of gods who come back loses the one idea that made Egyptian religion distinctive. That renewal comes out of something that has permanently stopped and stays stopped and is not thereby diminished. For 3,000 years that idea held. It was interrupted exactly once. In the 14th century, before the Common Era, a king came to the throne who had been named Amenhotep and who, in the 5th year of his reign, changed his name to Akhenaten, moved the capital to an empty stretch of desert in Middle Egypt. What Akhenaten did is usually described in terms of monotheism, and the argument about whether that word applies has run for 100 years. What is not in dispute is that he closed temples, suppressed the cults of the other gods, and had their names erased, including, remarkably, the plural word for gods itself. Osiris went with them. Akhenaten's own tomb at Amarna has no Osiris in it, no Duat, no 12 hours of the night, no ram-headed sun, no union in the 6th hour, no judgment scene, no scale, no 42 assessors. The entire underground machinery is simply gone, and the tombs of his courtiers show what replaced it, which is the part I find genuinely chilling. In a traditional Egyptian noble's tomb, the walls show the owner, his estates, his family, his career, his offerings, his journey. He is the subject of his own tomb. In the Amarna tombs, the owner is a small figure at the edge. The walls are given over to the royal family, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, at the window of appearances, the daughters, the palace, the processions through the city. The dead man appears mainly in the act of receiving gifts from the king, and his hopes for eternity are stated accordingly. The Ba flies out at dawn, goes into the city, enjoys the light of the Aten, and eats from the leftover offerings on the altars of the great temple. Even the Shabtis change. Akhenaten had Shabtis. Funerary conservatism runs deep, but the spell on them is not the 6th spell of the Book of the Dead. Osiris is not mentioned. The text addresses the sun disk instead. So here is my position on Akhenaten, and it runs against the romantic reading that has attached to him since the 19th century, in which he is a visionary, a proto-monotheist, a poet, a man ahead of his time. He did not liberate anything. He nationalized the afterlife. Consider what the Assyrian system had actually provided, a judgment conducted by 42 named assessors representing the provinces of Egypt, against a written and publicly known standard, with the outcome determined by your own conduct. Call it what it was, a rule of law applied to eternity. It has a defined procedure and a knowable standard, and the king is not the one who decides it. The king, when he dies, stands in the same hall as everyone else. Under Akhenaten, all of that is withdrawn, and what remains is patronage. Your continuation depends on your proximity to the royal house, and it is expressed on your own tomb walls as your relationship to the king. Nobody is judged. People are favoured. It lasted about 17 years. Within a generation, the temples were reopened, the names recut, the old material restored, and the capital abandoned to the sand. And the boy who presided over that restoration, who changed his own name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamen, was buried with a wooden frame in the shape of Osiris, filled with river silt, sown with barley and watered. The restoration held for another 800 years, and then the country began to be governed by other people, and the gods went travelling. Before she left, Osiris was renovated by a committee. When Alexander died and his general Ptolemy took Egypt, the new rulers faced a problem that every foreign dynasty in Egypt faced, and they solved it more inventively than most. They were Macedonians governing an Egyptian population with a growing Greek settler class who had no interest in worshipping animal-headed gods, and an Egyptian priesthood whose cooperation they needed. So they commissioned a deity. The tradition, which comes to us mainly through Plutarch and Tacitus, is that Ptolemy assembled advisors who understood both religious systems. Among them was Timotheus, from the family that had supplied the hierophants at Eleusis, and the Egyptian priest and historian Manetho. What they produced was Serapis. The Egyptian raw material already existed. At Memphis, the Apis bull was worshipped as a living manifestation of Ptah, and when an Apis bull died, it was mummified, buried in an enormous underground gallery at Saqqara, and understood to have merged with Osiris. The composite was called Osiris Apis, Osirapis in Greek. The Ptolemies took that existing god and gave him a Greek body. The cult statue in Alexandria showed a mature bearded man on a throne, in flowing robes, looking essentially like Zeus or Hades. On his head sat a modius, a grain measure, marking him as lord of the dead and of abundance. At his feet, in some versions, lay Cerberus. No jackal head, no falcon head, no mummy wrappings. A Greek could walk into that temple and know exactly what he was looking at. The great Serapeum in Alexandria, built up under Ptolemy III, stood on a rock plateau above the city and housed a daughter collection of the library. It became one of the most famous buildings in the ancient world, and one of the most successful pieces of religious design ever executed. Now, I want to be careful, because the popular version of this story overstates it. It is often told as though Serapis was invented from nothing by a cynical king. That is not quite right, and the scholarship has moved. The Osiris Apis cult was genuinely Egyptian and genuinely old. What the Ptolemies did was promote it, restyle its image, and place it at the centre of state religion. That is closer to a rebrand than to an invention. But it is a rebrand, and it worked, and it tells you something uncomfortable about how religions actually spread. Serapis went everywhere. Within 3 centuries there were temples to him from Britain to the Black Sea. He was more portable than Osiris had ever been, because he had been designed to be portable by people who understood their market. And here is the position I want to take on it, because I think it cuts against a common assumption. We tend to imagine that religious ideas travel on their merits, that the deepest ones spread furthest. The evidence from the ancient Mediterranean does not support that. What travelled was what had been packaged to travel. Osiris, in his Egyptian form, is almost untranslatable. A god you become rather than a god you petition, embedded in a specific river, a specific calendar, a specific language, and a burial practice nobody else could afford. Serapis was that god with the local requirements stripped out. Osiris stayed home. His wife and his Greek reissue went to Rome. Isis left first, and she went further than anyone could reasonably have predicted. The route out was commercial. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, the island of Delos in the Aegean was one of the busiest trading ports in the Mediterranean, and a major centre of the slave trade. Egyptian and Greek merchants operated side by side there, and 3 temples to the Egyptian gods were built on the island. Italian merchants working out of Delos carried the cult home with them. By the time of the dictator Sulla, in the early 1st century, before the Common Era, there was an association of Isiac priests in Rome. The Roman authorities did not care for it. There were repeated attempts to suppress the Egyptian cults through the 1st century, before the Common Era, including a senatorial decree ordering the destruction of shrines. Under Tiberius they were banned outright. Under his successor they were encouraged again, and after that the imperial house largely made its peace with her. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, she was everywhere. The Temple of Isis at Pompeii is one of the best preserved anywhere, largely because it was buried by Vesuvius, and then became, in 1764, the first building excavated at the site. Its congregation appears to have included a great many women, freedmen, and slaves. In Rome, the Isium Campense stood in the Campus Martius, rebuilt after fires, patronized by emperors. At Savaria in Pannonia, modern Szombathely in Hungary, there was a sanctuary reckoned the 3rd largest known anywhere after Alexandria and Rome. Household shrines to her have been found at Pompeii and Herculaneum and Cumae. Votive objects turn up from Syria to Britain, and in London, in a 1st century layer in Southwark, archaeologists found a pottery flagon with words scratched into it. The graffito reads, in Latin, "At London, at the Temple of Isis." Somebody in Roman Britain, on a wet island at the edge of the world, wrote the address of an Egyptian goddess on a jug. What she had become by then is set out in a group of texts called oretologies, first-person declarations inscribed at temples, in which the goddess announces herself. The most famous was found at Khoiak in Asia Minor. "I am Isis," it begins, "the mistress of every land." And then a list. She separated earth from heaven. She showed the stars their courses. She invented writing with Hermes. She made justice stronger than gold and silver. She ended cannibalism. She caused women to be loved by men. She gave the winds to sailors. She is identified in these texts with Aphrodite, with Demeter, with Artemis, with Selene, with essentially any major goddess in reach. The theological move is explicit. All of them are her, under local names. The best surviving description of what it felt like to belong to her comes from a novel. Apuleius, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, ends The Golden Ass with his hero rescued by Isis and initiated into her mysteries. He describes the procession in detail: priests in white linen, shaven heads, the rattle of the sistrum, garlands, crowds of initiates, and a decorated ship carried down to the shore to open the sailing season. Then he describes the initiation itself and refuses to describe it. He says only that he approached the boundary of death and trod the threshold and was carried through the elements and returned. Then he stops and tells the reader that he cannot say more. That silence is the oldest thing in this whole story. It is the same silence Iconofret kept at Abydos 1,500 years earlier, when he told us that he led the procession and would not tell us what happened in it. Now, there is a question that always arrives at this point, and I want to handle it carefully rather than either endorse it or dismiss it, because it is usually done badly in both directions. The image of Isis, seated with the infant Horus on her lap, offering him her breast, is one of the most reproduced in Egyptian art. Scholars call the type Isis lactans, and it is visually very close indeed to the Christian image of the nursing virgin, Maria lactans, which appears in Egypt among the Copts. The claim that one produced the other has been made for centuries, in both directions, by people arguing that Christianity absorbed a pagan goddess, and by people insisting it did nothing of the kind. Here is the evidence as it actually stands, and I am labelling what follows as contested rather than settled. Isis lactans can be documented in the Mediterranean from roughly 700 years before the Common Era down to the 4th century of the Common Era. The Maria lactans image appears uncontested in Egypt from about the 7th century onwards, and where it appears early, it is largely confined to monastic contexts. That is a gap of some 300 years in the wrong direction, and it means that the simple story, Isis becomes Mary, cannot be demonstrated from the images. So, I will not tell you it happened. What I will say is that the resemblance is real, that both traditions grew in the same soil, and that a shared visual language of divine motherhood is not the same claim as a lineage. The honest answer is that we do not know, and the people who are most confident about it in either direction are generally the ones who have looked at the fewest objects. What is not in doubt is how it ended, because that we can date to the day. In 392, the Emperor Theodosius banned pagan worship across the empire. Temples closed everywhere. In Egypt, the great sanctuaries went dark within a generation. Philae survived. Philae was an island in the first cataract of the Nile, at the southern edge of Egypt, carrying a temple of Isis built by the Ptolemies and extended by Roman emperors. Just north of it lay a smaller island, the Greeks called the Abaton, the unapproachable place, which was believed to hold the tomb of Osiris, and which is very probably the island Plutarch had heard about 3 centuries earlier. The reason Philae stayed open was political. South of the frontier lived the Blemmyes, a people of the eastern desert who were devoted to Isis and who came north regularly to worship at her temple. Rome and then Byzantium had treaty arrangements with them, and closing the temple would have meant a war on the southern border. So the priests stayed, Generation after generation, one family staffing a temple in a country that had stopped believing in it. On the 24th of August, in the year 394, a priest of that family carved something into the stone of a gateway built by Hadrian, the gateway that faced towards the island of the tomb. His name was Nesmetarakem, also read as Esmetakom, and he was the son of a priest and the grandson of a priest. He cut a figure of the god Mandalis, a Nubian deity worshipped by the Blemiers. Beside it he wrote a text in hieroglyphs, and beneath it a second text in Demotic. The hieroglyphic text says that he made this, and that he hopes it will remain for all time and eternity. He dated it, and the date he used was the birthday of Osiris. That inscription is the last hieroglyphic text ever carved. 4,000 years of a writing system, from the first labels on ivory tags at Abydos to a priest scratching a hope onto a Roman gateway. And it stops there, on a specific August day. Within a generation, in all probability, nobody alive could read it. The knowledge did not survive him by much. 58 years later, in 452, another member of that family carved another inscription on the second pylon. That one is in Demotic, and it is the last Demotic inscription known. Also a priest of Isis, also the son of a priest of Isis. After that, for 80 years, silence. Then, sometime between 535 and 537, the Emperor Justinian gave an order. The man who carried it out was a general named Narses, an Armenian who had come over to the Roman side, who commanded the troops in the region. The account of what he did comes from Procopius, and it is short. He pulled down the sanctuaries. He held the priests under guard. He sent the images to Byzantium. That is the end of ancient Egyptian religion, as an institution, as a continuous practice with people performing it. 3,500 years of documented worship, closed by a garrison commander acting on orders from a city 1,500 kilometers away. Note the detail that Procopius includes, though, because it is a strange one, the statues were not destroyed. They were shipped to Constantinople. Even in the act of ending her, they could not quite bring themselves to break her. They packed her up and took her to the capital. The temple was rededicated to Saint Stephen. What happened to the priests is not recorded anywhere. So, 3,000 years of one of the most elaborate religious systems the world has produced. And I want to come back at the end to the thing that started us off, because I think it explains everything else. They never wrote the story down. We have looked at what they did instead. They carved allusions into pyramid walls. They sailed a bark out into the desert once a year and fought a battle nobody was allowed to describe. They put a green stone beetle on the chest of the dead with a request written on its belly. They sowed barley in the shape of a god and let it die in the dark. They buried little blue figures who agreed, in advance, to do the work, set beside a story that was never told. It is an enormous amount of activity, and I think the reason is the one the texts hand us on nearly every page, in the formula, that appears so constantly that scholars stopped remarking on it long ago. The Osiris Unas, the Osiris Paib, the Osiris, scribe of the mat, Nahahu, the Osiris Tentriti, born of Tekhao. They were not remembering him. They were becoming him. A story is something that happens to somebody else. It has an outside and an audience, and a listener who is safely not the person in it. The whole apparatus of Egyptian funerary religion is designed to abolish that distance. The dead person does not hear about the judgment. The dead person makes the declaration in the first person to 42 judges by name. The mourner does not hear about the lament. She sings it with the goddess's name written on her arm. You cannot narrate a thing you are standing inside. There was never a story about Osiris, because Osiris was never a character. He was a position that the newly dead moved into, one after another, for 3,000 years. And the material we have is not the myth, it is the paperwork. That is why Plutarch could write it down, and they could not. He was outside it. He had the distance. that makes narrative possible. And he had it because it was not his. I think that is the strangest and most valuable thing this civilization left us. Not the gold, or the tombs, or the arithmetic of the pyramids. A 3,000-year demonstration that the most important stories a culture holds may be exactly the ones it never gets around to telling, because it is too busy living inside them. And a man on an island in the First Cataract, in the summer of 394, cutting hieroglyphs into a Roman gateway in a script that was about to die, dating his work by the birthday of a god whose story he had also never written down, hoping it would last for all time. Eternity. It has, so far. So let this be where we leave it. The Egyptians did not think of night as an absence. That is worth carrying with you. Darkness was not the removal of the light, but the place the light goes, and the work it does there. In the 6th hour, at the deepest point, the sun stops moving. Its soul goes down into a body that cannot get up, and rests there, and takes from that stillness the one thing it cannot make for itself. And then it goes on, and the eastern sky begins to grey, and none of it would have happened without the descent. They did not fear the 6th hour. They painted it on the walls of their tombs so they would recognise it when they arrived. Out at Abydos, the wind is still moving over the low desert. Under it, in a mound of broken pottery left by people whose names we will never have, there is a chamber where a stone god was laid on a bed with lions at the head and the foot. And somebody, a very long time ago, carried a jar of beer out to that place and set it down and walked home in the dark. The barley in the tomb grew as far as it could in the sealed room, and then it stopped, and it kept the shape of the god it had been planted in. Nothing in that story is asking anything of you. Let the light go down. Let it go where it goes. It has been doing this a long time, and it knows the way, and it will be back before you need it. Sleep now.